And now, a passage from Our Navy and the Barbary Corsairs, from Chapter 2, American Captives in Barbary. We have records of American victims of the Barbary pirates during the colonial period. 2 ships from Plymouth were seized in 1625 in the English Channel and taken into Sala. Several cases from Boston and neighboring towns are mentioned, some of whom were ransomed and some died in slavery. Among them was Dr. Daniel Mason, a graduate of Harvard College, who sailed from Charlestown in 1678, was taken into Algiers, and never returned. But the real beginning of our troubles came after the peace of 1783, as soon as the pirates of the Mediterranean had learned to recognize the new flag as that of a young, weak power likely to fall an easy prey to their cruisers. In October 1784, the American brig Betsy, Captain James Irving, bound to Tenerife, was captured by a corsair of Morocco and taken into Tangier. The crew were not enslaved, and after being held 6 months were released with the vessel. The Emperor of Morocco expressed a wish for friendly relations with the United States and gave orders that no other American vessels should be molested until there should be time to hear from Congress on the subject of negotiations for peace. July 25, 1785, the schooner Maria of Boston, Captain Isaac Stevens, bound to Cadiz, was captured off Cape St. Vincent by an Algerine xebec of 14 guns, and on the 30th of the same month, the ship Dauphin of Philadelphia, Captain Richard O'Brien, was taken about 50 leagues west of Lisbon. Both vessels, with their crews numbering 21 in all, were carried into Algiers. James L. Cathcart, a seaman on the Maria, says, "I understood the Spanish language which they all spoke, and was the only person on board who had any knowledge of the Barbary States. We were welcomed on board the xebec by the reis, or captain, a venerable old Arab who informed me that they were a cruiser of Algiers, that they had come through the straits in consequence of their having concluded a peace with Spain, and of the arrival of a British consul, Charles Logie, who informed them that they might take all such vessels that had not passports of a particular cut. After much ill treatment and hardship they arrived at Algiers August 4th. They were stripped, given filthy rags to wear, and marched through the streets. Later they were taken before the Dey, Mohammed by name, and were put to work at various sorts of labor. The captives, soon after their arrival, addressed an appealing letter to the American consul at Cadiz, setting forth their condition, stripped of their clothes and treated with barbarity. And they besought the consul's influence in obtaining for them an allowance for extra supplies and an early ransom. A second letter, written 6 months later by O'Brien to a commercial house of Lisbon, reports their being well provided for by the French and Spanish consuls. This was in consequence of the intercession in their behalf of the United States ministers Jefferson and Carmichael at the courts of Versailles and Madrid. The captains had their own table, and each had a small iron ring on one leg as a badge of slavery. The men worked at various trades and were allowed 15 ounces of bread daily. After making peace with Spain, Algiers went to war with Portugal, and the latter power kept the Straits of Gibraltar closed against Algerine cruisers so that American vessels in the Atlantic were safe from the corsairs. Few Americans entered the Mediterranean, and those that did were generally protected by the Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish cruisers. Sometimes Americans had forged or purchased passes so that the Algerines could not distinguish them from English vessels with which they dared not interfere. These passes were given to the vessels of nations having treaties with Algiers. They were inscribed with Arabic characters, and the corsairs tested their genuineness by means of a stick with notches corresponding to engraved figures on the margin of the pass. In 1793, a truce for 1 year between Portugal and Algiers was suddenly concluded through the influence of the English consul at Algiers for the express purpose, as it is alleged, of allowing the Algerines to cruise against Americans. In consequence of this, 4 frigates, 3 xebecs, and a brig, comprising nearly the whole cruising strength of the Algerine navy, passed through the straits in search of prey. 11 American vessels with 109 officers and men were captured in October and November 1793 and taken in to Algiers. After this, the courts of Lisbon and Madrid, for the protection of their trade with the United States, granted convoys to American vessels homeward bound to a certain latitude where they were beyond the reach of the pirates. October 8, 1793, the first of these later captures of Americans were made. the ships Thomas and Hope, and the schooner Despatch, and on the 11th, the brigs George, Olive Branch, and Jane were taken, followed the next day by the schooner Jay. On the 18th, the ship Minerva, Captain John McShane of Philadelphia, was captured off Gibraltar by a xebec of 20 guns, and on the 23rd, the ship President, Captain William Penrose, also of Philadelphia, was taken off Cadiz. The last two victims were the brigs Polly of Newburyport and Minerva of New York, the latter being captured November 23rd. Letters from McShane and Penrose describe their capture and captivity. The President, within a few hours' sail of Cadiz, fell in with a xebec of 16 guns under Spanish colors and showed her American flag. When within gunshot, the xebec hauled down her Spanish colors and hoisted the Algerine flag. They lowered a boat, boarded the President, and at once proceeded to loot the ship. They threw the crew down and stripped them of all their clothes, fighting savagely among themselves over the booty. The Americans were afterwards given a few dirty rags to put on. They were tumbled and kicked into the boat, taken aboard the pirate, and brought before the commander, Rais Mohammed, an infirm old man described as an emaciated, loathsome figure. Nearly 150 Algerines were crowded into this small vessel, which was filthy in the extreme and swarming with vermin. They arrived at Algiers October 30th and were ordered to the Bagnio Balek. The narrative of John Foss, seaman on the brig Polly of Newburyport, bound for Cadiz, is interesting. October 25, 1793, the Polly was overhauled by a brig flying the British flag. When she came near enough to make us hear, she hailed us in English, asked from whence we came, and were bound, which was immediately answered by Captain Bailey. The man who hailed us was dressed in the Christian habit, and he was the only person we could yet see on her deck. By this time the brig was under our stern. We then saw several men jump upon her poop to haul aft the main sheet, and saw by their dress and their long beard that they were Moors or Algerines. Our feelings at this unwelcome sight are more easily imagined than described. She then hove to under our lee, when we heard a most terrible shouting, clapping of hands, huzzahing, etc., and saw a great number of men rise up with their heads above the gunwale, dressed in the Turkish habit like them we saw on the poop. They immediately hoisted out a large launch, and about 100 of the pirates jumped on board, all armed, some with scimitars and pistols, others with pikes, spears, lances, knives, etc. They manned about 20 oars and rowed alongside. As soon as they came on board our vessel, they made signs for us all to go forward, assuring us in several languages that if we did not obey their commands, they would immediately massacre us all. They then went below into the cabin steerage, and every place where they could get below deck, and broke open all the trunks and chests there were on board, and plundered all our bedding, clothing, books, charts, quadrants, and every movable article that did not consist of the cargo or furniture. They then came on deck and stripped the clothes off our backs, all except a shirt and pair of drawers. The prisoners were then transferred to the Corsair, where they found 3 of the crew of the ship Hope of New York, which had been captured several days before. They arrived at Algiers November 1st, and were landed and conducted to the Dey's palace by a guard, and as we passed through the streets our ears were stunned with the shouts, clapping of hands, and other acclamations of joy from the inhabitants, thanking God for their great success and victories over so many Christian dogs and unbelievers. The Dey at this time was Hassan Pasha, his predecessor Muhammad having died in 1791. When brought before him, he told us he had sent several times to our government, entreating them to negotiate with him for a peace, and had never received any satisfactory answer from them, and that he was determined never to make a peace with the United States in his reign, as they had so often neglected his requests and treated him with disdain, adding, "Now I have got you, you Christian dogs, you shall eat stones." He then picked out 4 boys to wait upon himself, and then ordered the rest of us to be conducted to the prison billet. When we arrived there, we found several other Americans, and about 600 Christian slaves of other nationalities, with wretched habits, dejected countenances, and chains on their legs. After their names had been entered in the prison book, each man was given a blanket, a scanty supply of coarse clothing, and a small loaf of black, sour bread. They spent the night wrapped in their blankets on the stone floor. On the day after their arrival, the captives were loaded with chains of 25 to 40 pounds in weight, fastened to a ring about the ankle, the other end being bound around the waist. They were then put at various sorts of labor. When there were no foreign vessels in port and there was no chance of escape, the slaves were relieved of their chains while at work unless they were kept on as punishment for some misdemeanor. Many were employed in rigging and fitting out cruisers, discharging prizes, transporting the cargoes and other goods about the city, which on account of the extreme narrowness of the streets could be carried only by means of poles on their shoulders. Blocks of stone were carried from the mole to a new mosque the Dey was building. These were suspended from wooden frames borne by 4 men, and for any but the strongest the load was excessive. Others were employed in blasting rocks in the mountains. Fragments weighing from 20 to 40 tons were rolled down to the bottom of the mountain and placed upon heavy carts or sleds. These were drawn by teams of 200 or more men to a quay about 2 miles distant, whence they were transported on scows to the mole for the construction of a breakwater. This labor occupied the largest number of the slaves and was the severest that was imposed upon them, and they were cruelly beaten and driven by their overseers.